Hi, I'm Toby Heppel from Yachts and Yachting. We're here with British sailing team laser sailor Nick Thompson at the RYA Suzuki Dinghy Sailing Show. And Nick's going to talk us through his strategy and techniques for a typical laser race. So, Nick, can you tell us, before you're even out on the water, what sort of prep do you go through to get ready for a big regatta race?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think the preparation generally starts pretty early. I think you try and do a lot of venue prep and get a good understanding of the place you're going to before you even get there. And then, once you arrive at the venue, you're sort of looking to see if what you thought was going to be like previously is actually what the venue is like, and are there any things that really stand out, that might cause differences in the wind and things like that. So really it's about getting comfortable, making sure that the boat's ready and that you're ready to hit the water.
And then once you're out on the water, and you're sort of starting into your pre-start preparations, what are you looking for? What are the main key things you're looking at?
Yeah, again, it really ties in with the things you've done off the water beforehand. So, first off, it's checking that actually all the pre-race strategy things that you thought might be important for the day with the forecast and with the topography of the land and those sorts of things are actually relevant. And then from there, you start trying to form a strategy for the race. So, every day is different, but generally, sort of a strong wind day, you might be thinking more about trying to actually have a pretty set in stone strategy. So, you might be favouring a side of the course, and then you're actually thinking boat speed is going to be quite important. Whereas on a light wind day, you're probably open to being a bit more flexible with that strategy, and so you can sort of get a good idea before the start gun even goes of what you're trying to do for that race.
Okay, great. And so then you're sort of coming out of the start line. What are you looking at? Is it boats to windward, boats to leeward? I mean, how do you work out what your strategy is, boat on boat, straight out of the line?
Yeah, so that's always the most interesting one. It depends how the start's gone. I think if the start's gone well, generally that first minute, 2 minutes is pretty boat speed orientated, unless it's a sort of day where you're clocking straight into shifts and you've started in the middle of the line. So I'd say generally the first 2 minutes you're really focused in on your boat speed, and if you can get rid of the 10 guys around you, you're going to be in good shape probably if you've had a good strategy before the race. And then the focus switches quite quickly into the tactics of that race. So, as I said before, that every day is different. Some days, you're thinking very much head out the boat. You're looking around. You're looking for those little pockets of pressure, those wind shifts that are going to get you to that windward mark the quickest. And other times, you're very locked into trying to get to one side of that race course as quickly as possible.
And if your start's gone badly, what are you looking for? How do you find that lane out of bad air?
Yeah, the bad start's always the tricky one. I think the biggest thing there is not to panic. I think it's very easy to immediately go into a mode of, okay, I'm going to bang a corner. I think we've all been there, and actually trying to take the emotion out of that decision and think of it objectively is the way to do it. So you're looking immediately for options, and what I mean by that is, okay, maybe hitting slightly towards the side might be a good idea, but generally if the fleet's going one way and you're going the other, there's a reason why, so that's probably not going to be the game. Whereas actually if you can pick away one boat at a time, generally by the time you get to the windward mark, you're probably not going to be in too bad shape. Okay,
and sort of how far away from the windward mark are you starting to plan that rounding and look at that, boats around you again?
Yeah, really early. I think the whole way upwind you're always looking at where the other boats are, so you're always looking out for your position relative to the fleet. So if there's a lot of boats lining up on that starboard ley line early, and you're not in that top group, actually a port approach might not be a bad idea. There's a potential gain there. Whereas if there's a lot of boats coming in on the port ley line and you're one of the few on the starboard, again there's a real good chance to gain. So I think you build up a really good picture as you're going around the racetrack, and then you try and implement that as you get close to the windward mark. So we're talking probably halfway up the beat really is when you'd actually start planning that windward mark.
And best mark rounding in the world, you hit your starboard ley line, you're coming in, you're leading the fleet. Do you get your sail set up pre-mark rounding for the downwind? Is that?
Yeah, it's I think in the ideal world, if you're leading the race and you've got time, yeah, you would absolutely. You'd get the cunning off, you get the outhaul set to the reaching or downwind setting, and then obviously the van goes off right before you round the mark, and big main sheet ease. And again, another key there is making sure that your main sheet's sorted before you get to that windward mark. You know, I think every laser sailor in the world has had a moment where they've had the main sheet wrapped around their feet, which obviously doesn't work out. So so getting those things planned early is always a good thing if you can do it. And if you can't do it, then the priorities are getting that kicker off so you can actually make the bear away.
Okay, great. And then obviously you're on the downwind, so just give us a bit of an insight into a laser sailor's downwind strategy.
Yeah, I think again it's another it's a theme I'm going to keep coming back to is planning. I think when you're sailing up that upwind leg, you're getting a good understanding of what you think is going to happen on either a reach or a downwind leg, so if it's a reach where that mark is, so if it's a high reach or a low reach, because that's massively going to influence your approach to that windward mark. If it's a high reach and you come in slightly underlaying, you're going to get rolled by a lot of boats immediately, whereas if you can overstand slightly, you've got the opportunity to do that to them. So I think that's something that you can think about a lot before. If it's onto a run, you're thinking about where the pressure is, which side of the racetrack is going to be the most breeze, and are there any significant things that are going to influence that tactical decision? For example, is the leeward mark offset a long way to one side, or is there a lot of current that's going to push me off course downwind?
And presumably, running is where you see the biggest differences in your sort of sailing technique in the boat, between windy and light conditions. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely. I think in a laser and especially in a lot of dinghies, you see big angle changes downwind, and and a lot of that is to do with the waves and the wind. So obviously, if it's quite a wavy day and quite windy, you're just trying to surf. You're literally not worrying too much about the pressure, and you're just trying to surf as quickly as possible down each wave and make progress towards that leeward mark. Whereas in those lighter winds, you're generally sailing quite hard angles to get the flow going over the sail. So if you're hard by the lee, the flow's going from the leach to the mast, and if you're on a bit of a broad angle, it's obviously going the other way. So I think the laser especially is one of those boats where you're absolutely right. You see huge differences in technique across the wind ranges.
Okay, and then presumably in a breeze, the leeward mark's coming at you pretty quickly. So do you start prepping for that even further out again than the windward, or is that about half leg again?
Yeah, no. Again, it's exactly as you said. I think you're thinking about your strategy for the next upwind leg, probably halfway down that run. You're getting a good idea of where the breeze is for that next beat, what might be the big gains and losses potentially at that leeward mark. So once you've done that, you'll then pick if it's a gate, you'll pick a gate pretty early and have an understanding of which one's got the bias and which one's going to take you to the side of the course you want to go. That's often a missed opportunity. There is often people will sail too much for just one mark because of a lot of boats or because of a bias and not think too much about the strategy for the next beat. So it's something you'd prep early. Then as you get closer to the mark, if it's really breezy, as you're saying, get those controls on early. There's no reason not to pull on that Cunningham early before you get to the mark, get the outhaul set to the upwind position, because it just makes life easier. If you're messing around with all those things, when you get close to that mark, you're probably going to be in trouble.
Okay, great. And then can you tell us a little bit about the different strategies you have for a first beat versus a second beat? How much that's different, or is that exactly the same for you?
Yeah, no, it is. It's very different. I think generally a first beat, you're more locked into a strategy you might have had before the start. So you've got a good understanding of as I said, of which side could potentially pay. Whereas generally on a second beat, it's a lot more about managing the fleet. So if you're in the top few boats, you're hedging your bets to which side of the course or which shift you think is important. But you're also doing that whilst managing the boats behind you. So that might be one or two boats that you're trying to influence, or it might be actually just staying with the majority of the fleet, so you don't, give away too much leverage if there is a big shift or a big change that you haven't seen. So I think the strategy does change very quickly from the first beat to the second beat. And again, if you're at the back of the fleet on that second beat, that's an opportunity to make gains. I think often there's a lot of people that when they're at the back of a fleet will sort of split out to a corner quite early. And I think that really does open up the middle of the racetrack quite often. And if you watch some of the best sailors in the world, they'll be able to make up a lot of boats on the second beat purely by sailing out the middle of the course, taking each shift as it comes and thinking about one boat at a time.
And sort of on that note, when you're in a regatta situation and you're racing and you're doing either quite well or not very well, How much are you thinking about the points at the end of that regatta, and who you've got to look out for, and that sort of thing? Is that in your head?
Yeah, I think I'd be lying, and I think most sailors would be lying if they didn't think about their competition a little bit. You generally have a good idea of who the top guys are in the fleet, and as you're racing, you're sometimes looking around going, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Tom Burke and Robert Scheidt are going that way. I'm going this way. I wonder why. And you do think about that, but generally you try and stick to your plan. And the only changes that would really occur is exactly as you talked about. You get halfway through a regatta, the points are all starting to add up, and you get an idea of who's going to be your competition. And a good example would be something like Miami OCR that I just completed. I knew going into that final day I had a good points margin. I knew who my competition were, and I tried to stay pretty much between them and the fleet a lot of the time. So yeah, I think you certainly do think about the points quite a bit, but early on in the regatta you're really just trying to sail your own race.
Okay, and if you cross the finish line and you happen to have had a bad race, and say you've got another one coming up, how do you get your sort of head into the right frame of mind to start going through that pre-start and be in the right place to go out and win that next race? What do you do?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's a very important area that's often overmissed. I think the most important thing really is not to be afraid of just having a little vent. I think just let it out. If you've had a bad race, it's okay to be a little bit annoyed, but if you don't do that, I think often you'll be clinging onto it for the whole day in the next race. So I think often I'll have a little sort of internal moan at myself and be a bit frustrated. But then as soon as I've done that, I'll switch into the next race. So I'll talk to my coach, and if I don't have a coach, I'll try and process what happened in that race, where the mistakes were, where the gains were, where the good things were, and then try and move on to the next one. And I think if you can do that and not get too caught up into actually what were the things that went wrong, and then trying to do the complete opposite for the next race, which is often what people will do. I went left on that beat and the wind went right, so the next race I'm going right. That's generally not the way to race. It's about the next race as it comes around, and it's another opportunity to do well again. So yeah, I think switch off a little bit, get the frustration out, and then refocus to the next one.
Well, thanks for giving us your time, Nick, and let's hope there aren't too many bad races on the way to Rio.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.